30 seconds. That's all the time it takes for you to adjust your glasses or take a deep breath before standing up from your chair. But in the dead of night, on April 14, 1912, 30 seconds were the frozen boundary between reality and an eternal tragedy. Forget the myth of the predatory iceberg. What sealed the fate of that colossus was the deafening silence of the Atlantic and a visceral, split-second reaction. Before we dive into this forensic analysis of human error, I ask for a minute of your time. If the story of these 30 seconds that changed the world touches your heart in any way, and if you value the preservation of history, leave your mark right here. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you can, leave a comment with your thoughts or a prayer for the 1/500 souls. Because being forgotten is the true tragedy. The history we've consumed on the big screen and in textbooks over the last few decades has always sold us a comfortable, almost poetic narrative. We've been taught to picture the iceberg as an invisible predator, a monster of ice lurking in the dark of the North Atlantic, just waiting for the exact moment to strike at the pride of Edwardian engineering. But to truly understand what happened, I need you to shatter that romantic illusion right now. Let's lay our cards on the table. The real killer of the Titanic wasn't just that silent, floating mountain of ice. The ultimate executioner was the visceral, strictly human reaction to it. And this is where the legend loses its power, and reality comes to collect its dues. What sank the safest ship in the world wasn't just the bad luck of a moonless night, but rather an unforgiving math involving absurd speed, pure physics, and a desperate command given under the most extreme pressure a sailor's mind can endure. When the warning cut through the silence of the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch didn't have the luxury of cold reasoning or checking the manuals. He had to act. He acted on pure instinct, drawing on the practical knowledge that had kept him alive his entire career. What unfolded next was not, under any circumstances, an act of cowardice or cheap negligence. It was a brutal miscalculation born from conditioned reflexes. The problem is that human reflexes weren't designed to negotiate with the monumental inertia of a 46,000-ton Leviathan tearing through a mirrored sea at over 25 miles per hour. Do you know what that means in practice? When Murdoch ordered that instinctive evasive maneuver, he immediately waged a losing war against the immutable laws of physics. He tried to tame a metallic giant that, physically, had zero capacity to respond to that order quickly enough in the meager time it had left. But there was an even deeper flaw in this equation. The maritime culture of the time was paved with a blind faith in technology, an arrogance whispering that the machine would always beat nature. Murdoch made the exact same decision any experienced officer would make at the helm of a smaller vessel, attempting a sharp swerve that, ironically, was the very maneuver that doomed the ship. If you value deep dive analysis that goes beyond common sense and want to understand history to its core, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. The disaster didn't happen out of a lack of courage, but because, in that 30-second window, the instinctive attempt to save the Titanic was the exact trigger that sealed its death warrant. To understand exactly how the tragedy took shape long before the impact, we first need to tear down one of the most persistent myths we've been told over the decades. The idea that a starlit night is always the safest scenario for sailing. History tells us that the night of April 14th was uniquely clear, with a sky so packed with stars it looked unreal, which should have given any lookout a formidable advantage. But the documentary truth, the one those old sea dogs know all too well, is that this apparent clarity was the first major trap nature set for the ship. The sea wasn't just calm, it was in a state sailors call a flat calm or a sea of glass, a watery plain so smooth it looked like a giant obsidian mirror reflecting the heavens. And that is exactly where the nightmare hides, because that absolute dead calm stripped away the single safety element the lookouts could have had in that biting darkness: contrast. The issue is that, in night navigation back then, spotting icebergs didn't just rely on seeing a colossal white mountain, especially since these ancient ice formations turn into pitch-black masses when there's no moonlight to light them up. A crew's natural defense was always choppy waters. When waves crash against the hard base of the ice, they break and form a crest of white foam, a kind of glowing ring that acts as a natural warning beacon long before the main chunk of ice shows up on the horizon. However, in those early morning hours, perfectly mirrored and without a single breath of wind, the ocean simply didn't produce that telltale foam. This allowed the lethal threat to camouflage perfectly into the deep black, blending with the sky without leaving a single trace that human eyes could catch, until it was far too late. And as if nature wasn't already playing hardball against the steel colossus, human error stepped in to add the final ingredient to seal this perfect blind spot. There was an almost unbelievable logistical detail that history often glosses over. The lookouts in the Crow's Nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, who were the eyes of a ship carrying thousands of lives, were working completely blind. They relied solely and exclusively on their own bare eyesight, without any kind of optical help. The binoculars, essential and strictly mandatory tools for crossing the treacherous North Atlantic, were locked tight inside a cabinet. The reason for this borders on dark comedy, if it weren't so tragic: a trivial administrative screw-up at the port of Southampton, where Second Officer David Blair was reassigned at the last minute, and, in the rush of disembarking, simply forgot to hand the cabinet key over to his replacement. This string of misfortunes wasn't just some unlucky coincidence. It was the weaving of a web where every single loose thread weighed heavily toward the looming disaster. On one hand, we had a deadly optical illusion caused by a rare calm that masked the horizon line and stopped the waves from breaking. On the other, professionals enduring skin-burning cold, forced to squint into the void without the basic tools their vital jobs demanded. The entire stage was masterfully set, not for the danger warning to arrive with enough time to spare, but for it to explode onto the bridge at the absolute edge of the impossible, when the physics of time and distance left no room for a graceful exit. And it was in this exact context of partial blindness and a false sense of security that the Crow's Nest bell finally shattered the silence of the early morning, kicking off a countdown that would alter the course of maritime history forever. And when that metallic clang ripped through the peace of that night, the clock started the most dramatic countdown in seafaring history. 3 loud strikes on the bronze bell echoed down the mast. That was the universal maritime code to warn of an obstacle right in front of the bow. Up high, lookout Frederick Fleet, his hands likely shaking from the freezing cold and fueled by pure adrenaline as he spotted the anomaly rising from the pitch black, grabbed the internal comms telephone. Down below, on the bridge, the phone rang into the empty night. The dry sound of the device broke the silence of a room where the officers practically whispered just to keep their absolute focus on the voyage. The man who answered the call was 6th Officer James Moody, who brought the receiver to his ear with that cold, standard-issue British composure. On the other end of the line, Fleet's breathless voice fired off the message that would scar a whole generation. "Iceberg, right ahead." Moody just replied with a quick and polite "thank you," hung up the metal phone, and immediately passed the warning to the seasoned First Officer, William Murdoch. But there was a cruel catch in this bureaucratic gear of communication. The reality is that, between the visual spotting of the imminent danger, the physical effort to ring the bell, crank the handle, wait for someone to answer, voice the threat, And the final message actually reaching the ears of the commanding officer, precious and irreversible seconds of pure, silent agony, went straight down the drain of destiny. And it's in this exact moment that the nightmare becomes mathematically terrifying for anyone looking at the cold, hard facts. When Murdoch grasped the urgency of the warning, he had to make an extreme gut reaction decision at the helm of a 46,000-ton beast, tearing through the North Atlantic at over 25 miles per hour. The officer was backed up against the unforgiving wall of time, forced to try and pull off the impossible while the mountain of ice took physical shape just yards away. What followed was the suffocating tension of trying to change the path of a monumental floating city that, driven by the ruthless physics of hydrodynamics, flat out refused to obey any command that went against its own devastating natural inertia. And it's in the exact fraction of a second that follows, with the black mass of the iceberg growing terrifyingly large outside the bridge windows, that First Officer William Murdoch issues the command that will be eternally dissected by historians and naval architecture experts. The order echoed firm and sharp into the darkness. Hard a starboard, immediately followed by the abrupt pulling of the telegraphs to the engine rooms, demanding a full reversal of all engines. To understand the sheer scale and tragedy of this decision, we need to dive into the mechanical anatomy of this giant and the confusing naval terminology of 1912. Back then, this specific command didn't mean turning the ship to the right. In reality, it required Quartermaster Robert Hichens to desperately spin the heavy ship's wheel in a direction that would force the bow to swing sharply to port, to the left, attempting to dodge the lethal wall of ice looming ahead. On paper, and in the mind of a sailor forged by the sea and used to handling smaller vessels, this evasive reaction combined with hitting the brakes on the engines was a perfectly logical move. The standard instinctive survival response of any competent officer. The problem is that the ocean is not a paved highway, and the unforgiving laws of hydrodynamics have zero mercy for last-minute desperation. By pulling those heavy telegraph levers, Murdoch kicked off a chain reaction deep within the ship's steel belly that, in a cruel and deeply ironic twist, sabotaged his own rescue maneuver. But there was a monumental technical detail in this engineering setup, an invisible mechanical trap that entirely rewrites what we know about that fateful moment. The Titanic was driven by a formidable system of 3 gigantic propellers. The 2 side propellers could, in fact, be thrown into reverse through the immense, back-breaking effort of the stokers down below. However, the central propeller, strategically placed right in front of the rudder, was powered by a steam turbine designed to spin strictly forward. When the order for full reverse hit the bowels of the ship, the engineers blindly followed protocol. The side engines were reversed, but the massive central propeller simply had its engine shut off and ground to a halt. And it was in that exact moment that the true physical tragedy took hold. The Titanic's rudder, even though it was a colossal piece of cast steel, was already quietly considered by insiders to be far too small for the sheer weight and inertia of a vessel that massive. For the ship to change direction fast enough, the rudder needed a violent, continuous stream of water to constantly push against its metallic surface. That vital current was provided precisely by the force and constant rotation of that central propeller. By giving the order to stop the middle engine and reverse the sides, Murdoch inadvertently created a watery vacuum around the tail of the ship. He abruptly choked off the swirling flow of water washing over the rudder, drastically cutting down the thrust power needed to swing the bow. We can sit in the comfort of our homes today and judge this coldly. But what happened right there was pure, calculating physics clashing against the human reflex of self-preservation. Murdoch tried desperately to steer the ship away from the deadly obstacle, but by trying to hit the brakes on that moving mountain of metal, He actually braked the hull's very ability to steer. The Titanic lost its agility in the crucial seconds when it mattered most, sliding heavily forward like a massive vehicle skidding out on black ice with zero traction. The officer's instinctive order, born out of courage and the purest desperation, was the unfortunate hydrodynamic trigger that stretched out the ship's response time, allowing its own inertia to drag the 46,000-ton vessel relentlessly straight toward the jagged edge of the ice mountain. And it's precisely from this desperate, evasive maneuver that we arrive at the most staggering point of our documentary investigation, a real gut punch for any student of naval history. The ship was now skidding through the water, bleeding precious seconds of hydrodynamic response and sliding sideways toward that wall of dark ice. But what if I told you that the primal instinct for survival, that automatic human reaction of turning the wheel to avoid a crash, was exactly what signed the giant's definitive death warrant? We now step into what modern historians and engineers call the paradox of the head-on collision, a deeply uncomfortable revelation that usually gets ignored by commercial cinema, perhaps to avoid tarnishing the heroism of those officers in their final moments. The architecture of the Titanic was, without a shadow of a doubt, an unquestionable masterpiece of Edwardian engineering, meticulously designed to take a heavy beating. Its massive hull boasted 16 robust, watertight compartments, a smart system that would allow the vessel to keep floating safely, even if the first 4 were completely flooded by the sea. And this changes absolutely everything we know about the dynamics of the crash. The cold math from today's experts is merciless when breaking down the variables. If First Officer William Murdoch had simply frozen at the moment of the warning, letting the ship smash head-on into the iceberg at over 25 miles per hour, the Titanic probably never would have sunk. It might sound almost irresponsibly crazy to suggest that crashing head-on would save thousands of lives, but the physics behind this theory are structurally bulletproof. A direct head-on collision would have crushed the bow of the ship like a massive tin can. The impact would have been monumental, and the sheer kinetic energy would have violently thrown dozens of passengers out of their bunks, sparking widespread panic on board. The sailors and stokers sleeping in the forwardmost sections would almost certainly have lost their lives in the immediate crushing of metal. However, and this is the absolute crux of the entire tragedy, the massive energy of that crash would have been almost entirely absorbed by the flexible structure of the bow itself. The damage would have been contained to the first 2 or 3 watertight compartments. The rest of the giant ocean liner, protected by its heavy transverse bulkheads, would have stayed intact and, most importantly, floating on top of the freezing water. The catch is that the human brain, hardwired by evolution and practical experience, wasn't built to keep the pedal to the metal while staring down a wall of rock or ice. Pure instinct screamed at Murdoch to swerve immediately, and it was exactly that attempt to scrape by the side that turned a perfectly containable head-on impact into a lethal, sprawling gash. By slamming sideways against the submerged, jagged base of the iceberg, the ice pushed back with crushing lateral pressure, popping rivets and buckling heavy steel plates along more than 300 feet of the hull. This treacherous scrape below the waterline didn't rip open one continuous hole, but rather a lethal series of small, intermittent slits that exposed 5 watertight compartments to the North Atlantic all at once. And it was right then that the ship's cutting-edge engineering was summarily defeated. It didn't fall to the brute force of nature, but gave way because the incredible length of the side damage easily blew past the mathematical margin the flotation system had been built for. The logical, human, and even heroic effort of a veteran sailor trying to dodge a crash was, in cold, hard mechanical reality, the very maneuver that slit the ship's veins. The Titanic didn't perish because of structural arrogance or reckless luxury, but because of the fateful paradox that running instinctively from danger was exactly what guaranteed its total destruction, sealing the fate of 1,500 souls at the bottom of the ocean. And it's in this exact unfolding of physics, right after the hull was fatally compromised by that instinctive evasive swerve, that we witness one of the most cruel and fascinating contrasts in the entire documentary record of the disaster. What followed the initial impact wasn't some deafening cinematic explosion, like the big blockbusters often want us to believe, but rather a continuous, heavy, and lethal scraping that lasted an agonizing 10 seconds. During that incredibly brief flash of time, the heavy mountain of ice slid mercilessly down the ship's starboard side, meticulously grinding against the thick steel plates just below the waterline, while the nightlife carried on absolutely untouched in the bright, luxurious lounges above. For the wealthy first-class passengers, many of whom were already getting ready for bed, or enjoying a nightcap in the heavily carpeted, elegant smoking rooms, the end of the world announced itself in a curiously poetic and almost harmless way. What they felt beneath their feet definitely wasn't the violent, chaotic jolt of a major, imminent shipwreck. It was just a faint, steady vibration, a mechanical shudder so gentle that historical accounts from survivors frequently describe it feeling exactly like a train rolling quickly over thousands of small marbles. Not a single crystal glass tumbled from the finely decorated dining tables. No antique chandeliers swung out of control, and there wasn't the slightest hint of panic or alarm echoing down the massive corridors. The colossal inertia and formidable stability of the ship absorbed the surface shock so efficiently that the perception of danger was perfectly masked by the absolute comfort of Edwardian engineering. But there was a deeply disturbing and fatal catch hidden in all that apparent calm. While the elite floated in a bubble of peaceful ignorance, the true face of the tragedy was already revealing itself immediately and brutally in the cold, dark bowels of the metallic giant. The problem is that dozens of feet below all that splendor, there was no luxury or structural cushioning capable of softening the crushing fury of hydrodynamics. In Boiler Room No. 6, where exhausted men worked covered in sweat and soot to feed the ship's fiery heart, the silent 10-second scrape was experienced as the literal equivalent of the apocalypse. For those stokers, squeezed and forgotten in the operational depths of the hull, the noise didn't sound like marbles under any circumstances. It was the terrifying, torturous shriek of forged steel, twisting and tearing in half under absolutely monstrous pressure. They watched in stunned horror as the impenetrable containment wall of the safest ship in the world burst violently inward, giving way with the same humiliating ease as a piece of paper being unceremoniously torn apart. And it was in that exact moment that the ocean reclaimed its absolute sovereignty over the arrogance of machines. The North Atlantic, with its freezing sub-zero temperatures, didn't just leak slowly and gradually through the torn seams. It invaded the compartment with a destructive, lethal explosion, blasting through the buckled sides with an overwhelming kinetic force that was impossible to contain. The boiler room was instantly swept by a furious, non-stop torrent that ripped up the heavy iron floor plates, threatening to drown any crew member in the dark who hesitated for a split second. These brave workers were instantly forced into a blind dash for survival, running desperately to outrun the whirlpool before the massive watertight doors came crashing down from the ceiling, turning that boiler section into a submerged tomb. This macabre duality, where the almost undetectable lightness of a surface scratch rested directly above the most violent destruction in the depths, dictated the cruelest rule of that night. The giant was already fatally wounded, bleeding out fast through its metallic veins, but the vast majority of souls walking its upper decks didn't have the slightest clue that the countdown to the bottom of the sea had already begun. And it's right in this terrifying contrast between the aquatic chaos of the boiler rooms and the undisturbed peace of the upper decks that we enter the most agonizing chapter of this story. A dark phase we could call lethal inertia. Immediately after that prolonged scrape against the ice, orders from the bridge brought the engines to a halt, and the ship's massive steel heart simply went silent. The Titanic, a colossus arrogantly designed to tame the fury of the seas, suddenly became just a dead metallic island, drifting under the endless, freezing blackness of the North Atlantic. The dead silence that took over the night wasn't a sign of safety, but the oppressive prelude to a tragedy the human mind was still struggling to process. And the most disturbing part of this sudden calm is that absolutely no one in the chain of command took the immediate step of sounding the general alarms to wake the passengers and man the emergency stations. The problem is that the very same flawless engineering that built the ship also forged a lethal psychological trap for everyone on board. The widespread belief that the Titanic was unsinkable wasn't just a gimmick to sell tickets. It was a blind dogma, an unshakable faith in human superiority that completely numbed the survival instinct. During the first and most crucial 45 minutes after the impact, while the sea furiously flooded the lower compartments and dragged the bow toward the abyss, life in the luxurious lounges carried on at an almost mundane pace. Bundled-up passengers picked up chunks of ice on the deck like exotic souvenirs of the trip. Gentlemen in tailcoats smoked cigars and casually chatted about the engines stopping, and many simply went back to sleep under their heavy blankets. But there was an invisible, cruel detail running against the clock. Time was bleeding through the holes in the hull at a speed no man there was ready to accept. While the officers inspected the damage in secret, the lack of an aggressive crisis protocol and clear communication meant that the most valuable minutes of the entire crossing were swallowed up by a bubble of false hope. And that completely changes how we look at the blame that night. Because that instinctive 30-second mistake on the bridge didn't just end mechanically at the moment of impact, it stayed alive and active in the collective denial that the giant was dying right beneath their feet. This systemic complacency wasted almost an entire hour that could have been used to fill the lifeboats to the brim, proving that while the physical shipwreck definitely started on the ice, the real human tragedy was cemented in those hidden minutes of pure inertia. And so we wrap up this deep dive into the dark waters of the North Atlantic, finally understanding that the true tragedy of the Titanic goes way beyond a mechanical collision with a mountain of ice. When we look at the wreckage of what was the greatest triumph of human engineering of the 20th century, we realize that what rests in the ocean's abyss isn't just twisted steel and luxury furniture. It's the crushing weight of decisions made in the exact time it takes to draw a breath. Just 30 seconds. That was the unforgiving chronological gap that separated absolute glory from one of the most irreparable and painful disasters in our modern history. First Officer William Murdoch definitely wasn't some scared rookie facing danger. He was a brilliant sailor forged by the rigors of the sea, who tried to save the ship with the very best of his survival instincts and unquestionable practical experience. The problem is that physics, with all its cold math, simply does not forgive human reflex, and it never negotiates with the brutal inertia of 46,000 tons tearing through the mirrored waters of that silent early morning. The unsinkable colossus wasn't brought down just by an invisible ice predator in the dark, but by the lethal combination of institutional pride, blind faith in technology, and one man's visceral reaction to the unthinkable. That order to turn the wheel and reverse the engines, given under the most extreme, suffocating pressure the human mind can endure, was the tragic maneuver that turned a perfectly manageable head-on crash into a lethal, definitive death sentence. And that completely changes how we should look at this event. It serves as a perpetual historical reminder that nature will always have the final say whenever arrogance takes the helm of our progress. If this documentary investigation gave you a new perspective and added value to your critical understanding of history, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel to help us keep rescuing these memories, and share in the comments your take on Murdoch's incredibly difficult decision on that fateful night. History comes alive when we question it with maturity and respect. May the memory of those 1,500 souls rest in peace, while we who are left to tell the story carry the weight of this harsh, unforgiving realization forever. A giant's fate was not sealed by the ice, but carved irreversibly into the 30 seconds of silence before the final impact.